Mist drifted through Mikawa province in the grey hour before dawn, curling over rice paddies that reflected the pale sky like scattered mirrors across the valley floor. The farmers stirring in their villages paid little attention to the banners that flew over Okazaki Castle, or the lords who claimed the right to tax their harvests. Banners changed, lords died. The rice still needed planting. This was Japan, in the age of the warring states, when the old order had shattered and no one yet knew what would replace it. Inside the castle, on the last day of January in 1543, a boy was born to Matsudaira Hirotada, lord of a clan whose survival was never certain. They named the child Takechiyo. His mother, Odai no Kata, held him in the first hours of his life, not knowing that political calculations would soon take him from her permanently, or that this infant would one day rule all of Japan. The Matsudaira were trapped. To the west, the Oda clan pressed against their borders with relentless aggression. To the east, the powerful Imagawa demanded submission and tribute. Hirotada's father and grandfather had both died in battle, trying to preserve the clan's independence. And Hirotada himself spent his days calculating which neighbor posed the greater threat and which alliance might buy another year of survival. In such circumstances, every asset had value, including a 4-year-old son. In 1547, Hirotada made his choice. He would send Takechiyo east to the Imagawa capital at Sunpu, offering his heir as a hostage to secure the alliance he needed against the Oda. The boy would be raised among strangers, his presence guaranteeing his father's loyalty more effectively than any oath. It was standard practice in the Sengoku period, when written agreements meant nothing and a lord's child in your castle meant everything. The journey east began on a morning when Takechiyo was too young to understand why he was leaving or where he was going. Retainers carried him along mountain roads, through forests where sunlight filtered through cedar branches, past villages where farmers paused their work to watch the small procession pass. The boy had never traveled beyond Okazaki's walls. The world revealed itself to him mile by mile, wider and stranger than anything he had imagined. They never reached Sunpu. Somewhere along the route, men loyal to Oda Nobuhide intercepted the party. There was confusion, shouting, the clash of weapons that the child would not have understood. When it ended, Takechiyo found himself traveling west instead of east, carried toward the domain of his father's enemy. The Oda had stolen the Matsudaira heir. The hostage intended to guarantee one alliance had become leverage for demanding another. Nobuhide sent a message to Hirotada: break with the Imagawa, ally with the Oda, or your son dies. The demand forced a calculation that most fathers would refuse to make, and that history has remembered as either monstrous pragmatism or admirable resolve. Hirotada's reply came back unchanged by sentiment. Kill the boy if you wish. The Imagawa alliance will hold. Takechiyo was not killed. A dead hostage had no value, and Nobuhide was practical enough to recognize that circumstances could change. For 2 years, the boy lived among the Oda, treated neither cruelly nor kindly, his existence suspended in an uncertainty that no child should have to endure. He learned to watch. He learned to wait. He learned that his own father had weighed his life against political advantage and found it wanting. In 1549, Oda Nobuhide died. Months later, word arrived that Matsudaira Hirotada had also been killed, struck down by one of his own retainers, according to some accounts, though the truth of his death remains unclear. The father who had refused to ransom his son was gone. The boy was 6 years old. The Imagawa moved quickly. With both Nobuhide and Hirotada dead, the power dynamics that had kept Takechiyo among the Oda no longer held. Imagawa Yoshimoto negotiated, or simply demanded, the boy's transfer to Sunpu. The journey that had been interrupted 2 years earlier finally reached its destination. Takechio arrived at the Imagawa capital as the hostage his father had originally intended him to be, his presence guaranteeing the submission of a Matsudaira clan, now ruled by regents who administered his domains on behalf of their distant master. The years that followed transformed captivity into something more complicated than mere imprisonment. Yoshimoto recognized that a well-educated vassal served his interests better than a broken one, and he entrusted Takechio's development to a teacher whose influence would shape everything the boy became. Sesai Choro was a Zen monk, an advisor to the Imagawa lord, and a man whose understanding of strategy and human nature had been refined through decades of observation. He saw something in the quiet, watchful child that others might have missed. The monk taught Takechio to read Chinese classics, to study history and military strategy, to play Go with a patience that could outlast any opponent's aggression. But the deeper lessons had nothing to do with texts or games. Sesai taught the boy to see situations whole, to understand not just what was happening, but why, not just who held power, but how that power might shift. He taught him that patience was not passivity, that waiting could be a form of action, that the man who kept his composure while others lost theirs had already won half the battle. The instruction continued for years, shaping a mind that would eventually outthink every rival it encountered. Takechio grew into adolescence at Sunpu, his body thickening into the stocky, powerful frame he would carry through life. Yoshimoto granted him an adult name, Matsudaira Motoyasu, and arranged his marriage to Lady Tsukiyama, a woman with Imagawa blood whose presence in his household bound him more tightly to his captors. She bore him a son, Nobuyasu, and a daughter. The family that formed around him belonged to the web of obligations that kept him loyal to the Imagawa. Each relationship another thread in a net he could not yet cut. At 15, Motoyasu experienced his first battle. The Imagawa sent him to command Matsudaira troops at the siege of Terabe, a fortress held by enemies of the clan. The young man who had spent his entire conscious life as a hostage now led warriors in combat, men who served him because of who his father had been, fighting under Imagawa banners because no other option existed. He performed well. Yoshimoto's confidence in his young vassal grew. By 1560, that confidence had expanded into ambition. Imagawa Yoshimoto assembled an army of perhaps 25,000 men, the largest force seen in the region in years, and marched west toward Kyoto. He intended to claim dominance over all of Japan, and the road to the capital ran through Oda territory. Motoyasu, now 17, commanded a unit assigned to capture a fortress along the route. He took it successfully while the main army advanced. The campaign should have ended with Imagawa triumph. Yoshimoto's forces vastly outnumbered anything the Oda could field, and the fortresses along the route were falling one by one. But Oda Nobunaga, the young lord who had inherited his father's domains after years of internal warfare, was not the kind of man who accepted unfavorable odds as final. He gathered what troops he could and gambled everything on a single strike. The attack came at Okehazama during a sudden rainstorm. Yoshimoto had paused to rest, his army dispersed, his samurai sheltering from the weather. Nobunaga's forces struck the command camp with a violence that allowed no organized response. In the chaos of rain and screaming and clashing blades, Imagawa Yoshimoto was killed. His head was taken as a trophy. The great army that had seemed unstoppable collapsed in a single afternoon. News of the disaster reached Motoyasu in the fortress he had captured. The lord who had held him hostage for over a decade, who had educated him and married him to a kinswoman, and given him his adult name, was dead. The Imagawa domains would splinter. The obligations binding the Matsudaira to their eastern overlord had dissolved in an afternoon of rain and blood. For the first time in his life, Motoyasu faced a choice that was entirely his own. He could remain loyal to the Imagawa, return to Sunpu, serve whoever emerged from the succession disputes that would follow. Or he could go home. He gathered his men and marched east toward Mikawa, toward the castle where he had been born. The retainers who had served his father, who had waited through 13 years of Imagawa occupation, opened the gates of Okazaki to receive their rightful lord. The hostage had returned. The boy who had learned patience in captivity now controlled his own fate. He was 17 years old. The lessons Sesai Choro had taught him were about to meet the test of actual power. And somewhere to the west, Oda Nobunaga, the man whose audacity had killed Yoshimoto and set Motoyasu free, was consolidating his own position, unaware that the young lord now returning to Okazaki would become the most important ally of his life. The first years of independence nearly destroyed him. Motoyasu had returned to a domain weakened by over a decade of Imagawa occupation, its warriors scattered, its finances depleted, its borders vulnerable to neighbors who sensed opportunity in the chaos following Yoshimoto's death. The Imagawa remnants to the east demanded he honor his obligations to them. The Oda, to the west, remained the hereditary enemy his father had fought. And within Mikawa itself, forces were stirring that would soon threaten everything he was trying to build. The young lord worked with a discipline that would characterize his entire life. He rode through his territories, meeting with local samurai, assessing which men could be trusted and which were waiting to see how events unfolded before committing themselves. He reviewed the domain's finances, its granaries, its defensive positions. He listened more than he spoke, remembering Sesai's teaching that understanding must precede action. The retainers who had served his father began to recognize that their young master, despite his years among the Imagawa, had returned to them as something more than a figurehead. The question of alliance could not be deferred. Mikawa was too small and too exposed to stand alone against the powers surrounding it. The Imagawa were collapsing, their strength bleeding away through succession disputes and defecting vassals. No help would come from that direction. Which left the Oda, the clan that had kidnapped him as a child, whose lord his father had defied unto death, whose aggression had shaped every strategic calculation of Motoyasu's youth. But Oda Nobunaga was not his father's enemy. The man who had killed Yoshimoto at Okehazama was building something new, his ambition extending far beyond the provincial conflicts that had consumed previous generations. Motoyasu sent envoys west. Nobunaga received them with interest. In 1562, the two young lords met at Kiyosu Castle to formalize an alliance that would endure for 20 years and reshape the map of Japan. They were a study in contrasts. Nobunaga was volcanic, brilliant, cruel, impatient, given to rages that terrified his subordinates and innovations that bewildered his enemies. He dressed in outlandish fashion, defied conventions that other lords considered sacred, and pursued his goals with a ferocity that left no room for hesitation or sentiment. Motoyasu was his opposite in temperament, steady, watchful, willing to absorb insults and setbacks that would have provoked Nobunaga to immediate violence. Where Nobunaga burned, Motoyasu endured. The partnership worked precisely because their differences complemented each other. The alliance gave Motoyasu security on his western border, freeing him to deal with threats closer to home. The most dangerous of these came not from rival lords, but from within his own domain. The Ikoiki, militant Buddhist communities, organized around the true Pure Land sect. had established themselves throughout Mikawa, their temples serving as centers of resistance to samurai authority. In 1563, they rose in open revolt, and the uprising tore through Motoyasu's domain like fire through dry grass. The rebellion tested him in ways that external enemies never had. Some of his own retainers, devout followers of the true Pure Land teachings, found themselves forced to choose between their religious convictions and their loyalty to their lord. Families split. Men who had fought beside each other turned their weapons on former comrades. The violence was intimate and bitter. Every battle fought against people who had been neighbors and allies only months before. Motoyasu prosecuted the war with methodical determination, his forces grinding down the Ikoiki strongholds one by one. The campaign lasted into 1564, its conclusion coming only when the last fortified temples had fallen and the surviving rebels had submitted or fled. The young lord who emerged from this crucible had learned something that books and teachers could not convey. That ruling meant making decisions that would cause suffering, that loyalty could fracture along lines no one anticipated, that a lord who flinched from necessary harshness would not remain a lord for long. In 1567, he took a new name. Matsudaira Motoyasu became Tokugawa Ieyasu, the transformation marking more than personal preference. The Tokugawa name linked him to the Minamoto clan, the warrior lineage that had established Japan's first shogunate centuries earlier. Only a Minamoto descendant could legitimately claim the title of shogun, the military ruler who governed Japan in the emperor's name. Whether Ieyasu was already contemplating such heights or simply positioning himself for possibilities he could not yet define, the name change announced ambitions that his modest domain could not contain. The years that followed wove his fate ever more tightly with Nobunaga's. As the Oda Lord conquered his way toward Kyoto, Ieyasu secured the eastern flank, his reliability freeing Nobunaga to concentrate forces westward. Their correspondence continued across the miles that separated them. Strategies coordinated, intelligence shared, the alliance functioning with an efficiency rare in an age when betrayal was the norm rather than the exception. Ieyasu's domain grew as Nobunaga's conquests eliminated rivals and redistributed their territories. The patient lord of Mikawa was becoming a power in his own right. But the alliance extracted costs that Ieyasu would carry for the rest of his life. In 1579, Nobunaga sent word that he suspected treachery, that Ieyasu's wife, Lady Tsukiyama, and his eldest son, Nobuyasu, had been conspiring with the Takeda clan, Nobunaga's most dangerous enemy. The evidence was thin, the accusations possibly fabricated by rivals seeking to damage Ieyasu's position. None of that mattered. Nobunaga demanded that Ieyasu prove his loyalty by eliminating the supposed traitors. The demand permitted no negotiation. Ieyasu faced a choice that no political calculation could make bearable. His wife and his heir, the son who should have succeeded him, the boy he had raised and trained and prepared for leadership, stood accused by the ally whose support he could not afford to lose. To refuse Nobunaga's demand would shatter the alliance and invite destruction. To comply would mean ordering the deaths of his own family. He complied. Lady Tsukiyama was executed. Nobuyasu was ordered to commit seppuku, the ritual suicide that samurai custom demanded of those who had lost their honor. The young man who had done nothing wrong, or nothing that the historical record can confirm, died because his father's political survival required it. Ieyasu had weighed his son's life against his own position, and the calculation had come out the same way. His own father's calculation had come out decades earlier. when Hirotada had refused to ransom a 4-year-old boy from Oda captivity. The loss left marks that Ieyasu never discussed, but that those around him could perceive. He became more guarded, more careful, more inclined to keep his own counsel, even among those he trusted. The warmth that had occasionally surfaced in his dealings with family and close retainers retreated behind walls that few could penetrate. He had learned what his father had known, that lordship meant sacrificing what you loved when circumstances demanded it. The lesson did not make him cruel, but it made him hard in ways that would serve him well in the decades ahead. The wars against the Takeda clan consumed the early 1580s, Ieyasu fighting alongside Nobunaga's forces against the last great power blocking Oda dominance of central Japan. The Takeda had nearly killed him years earlier at a battle called Mikatagahara, where their cavalry had shattered his forces and sent him fleeing for his life. He had never forgotten that humiliation. When the Takeda finally fell in 1582, destroyed by the combined weight of the Oda-Tokugawa alliance, Ieyasu was there to witness the end of the clan that had haunted his nightmares. Weeks later, everything changed again. On June 21st, 1582, Oda Nobunaga was in Kyoto, resting at a temple called Honnoji with only a small guard. One of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned traitor and attacked the temple with overwhelming force. Nobunaga, trapped and surrounded, died in the flames. Some accounts say by his own hand, others that he fell fighting, but all agree that the man who had seemed destined to unite Japan perished that night in fire and treachery. Ieyasu was far from Kyoto when the news reached him, traveling in territory that had suddenly become hostile. Mitsuhide's forces controlled the roads between him and safety. The domains he had passed through as Nobunaga's ally now looked at him as a potential prize, or a potential victim. He had a small escort, no army, and hundreds of miles of dangerous country between him and home. The journey that followed would become legend. Ieyasu and his companions fled through Iga province, guided by local men whose communities had reason to help enemies of the powers that had oppressed them. They traveled by night, hid by day, crossed mountains through passes known only to hunters and smugglers. At every step, discovery meant death. The lord who had spent his childhood as a hostage, who had learned patience through years of captivity, now needed every lesson that experience had taught him simply to survive. He reached Mikawa alive. Behind him, Japan was plunging into chaos, the succession to Nobunaga's domains unleashing conflicts that would take years to resolve. Ieyasu secured his own territories and watched as the man who would become his next great rival, a general named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, moved with astonishing speed to avenge Nobunaga and claim his legacy. The alliance that had defined 20 years of Ieyasu's life had ended in a single night of flames. The patron who had protected him, who had demanded his son's death, who had elevated him from minor lord to major power, that man was gone, and the political landscape of Japan had become a blank slate on which new ambitions would write themselves. Ieyasu was 39 years old. He had survived childhood captivity, religious uprising, family tragedy, and assassination. The education was not yet complete, but the student had proven he could endure whatever his teachers devised. Toyotomi. Hideyoshi moved through the chaos of Nobunaga's death like a fire finding dry wood. Within 11 days of Honnoji, he had force-marched his army back from a distant campaign, destroyed the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide, and positioned himself as Nobunaga's avenger and rightful successor. Other generals had better bloodlines, stronger claims, deeper connections to the Oda legacy. None of them moved fast enough to matter. By the time Ieyasu had secured his own borders and assessed the new situation, Hideyoshi had already seized the momentum that would carry him to supremacy. The two men had known each other for years, their paths crossing during the campaigns they had fought under Nobunaga's banner. They could hardly have come from more different origins. Ieyasu was born to lordship, his Matsudaira blood entitling him to a position that captivity had delayed but never erased. Hideyoshi was the son of a peasant, a man who had entered Nobunaga's service as a sandal-bearer and risen through sheer ability to become one of Japan's most formidable generals. His climb from nothing to near everything represented a rupture in the social order that samurai tradition could barely comprehend. Ieyasu watched Hideyoshi's consolidation of power with the calculating patience that had become his defining characteristic. The new hegemon was absorbing Nobunaga's former vassals, defeating those who resisted, rewarding those who submitted. One by one, the great lords of Japan were acknowledging Hideyoshi's supremacy, some eagerly, some reluctantly, all recognizing that the alternative was destruction. The question that Ieyasu could not defer forever was whether he would join them. He decided to fight. In 1584, Ieyasu allied with Oda Nobuo, one of Nobunaga's sons who had been pushed aside in Hideyoshi's takeover, and marched against the new ruler's forces. The campaign that followed, known as Komaki and Nagakute, would prove to be the only major military confrontation between the two men, and its outcome would shape their relationship for the rest of Hideyoshi's life. The armies maneuvered through the hills and valleys of Owari province, each side probing for advantage, neither willing to risk everything on a single decisive battle. Ieyasu fought with the cold precision that Sesai had taught him decades earlier, refusing to be drawn into engagements that favored his opponent's larger forces. When Hideyoshi sent a detachment to strike at Ieyasu's home territory, Ieyasu intercepted it at Nagakute and destroyed it, a tactical victory that demonstrated he could not be easily overwhelmed. But tactical victories did not translate into strategic success. Hideyoshi's resources dwarfed Ieyasu's, and time favored the larger army. The campaign ground on through months of inconclusive skirmishing, neither side able to force a decision. Eventually, Oda Nobuo, whose cause had provided the justification for Ieyasu's resistance, made a separate peace with Hideyoshi, leaving Ieyasu isolated. The war ended without a clear winner, but the political reality was unmistakable. Hideyoshi's position had survived the only serious military challenge it would face. What followed was a negotiation conducted through gestures rather than words. Hideyoshi needed Ieyasu's submission to complete his unification of Japan. Ieyasu needed terms that would preserve his domains and his dignity. Neither trusted the other enough to meet without guarantees that proved extraordinarily difficult to arrange. The deadlock continued through 1585 and into 1586, each man waiting for the other to make a move that would reveal weakness. Hideyoshi broke the impasse with a gesture so unexpected that it still astonishes historians. He sent his own mother to Ieyasu as a hostage, the woman who had raised him from peasant childhood, who had witnessed his impossible rise, who represented the only family connection that mattered to a man with no noble lineage. Hideyoshi placed her in Ieyasu's power as a guarantee of good faith. The message was unmistakable. I am willing to risk what I love most to secure your cooperation. Ieyasu understood what was being offered and what was being asked. He traveled to Kyoto, met with Hideyoshi, and formally acknowledged the peasant's son as his superior. The submission was real, but not absolute. Ieyasu retained his domains, his army, his autonomy, in matters that did not conflict with Hideyoshi's interests. He became the second most powerful man in Japan, his position secured by an arrangement that benefited both parties. Hideyoshi gained the legitimacy that came from Ieyasu's recognition. Ieyasu gained time. The years that followed tested the relationship in ways that neither man fully anticipated. Hideyoshi's ambitions expanded beyond Japan to encompass dreams of continental conquest, his armies invading Korea in 1592 and again in 1597 as the first step toward an assault on China itself. The campaigns were disasters, costly, brutal, and ultimately futile. But they consumed the energies and resources of lords whom Hideyoshi might otherwise have watched more carefully. Ieyasu participated in the preparations for invasion, but somehow never led troops to Korea. His forces remained in Japan, resting and rebuilding, while his potential rivals exhausted themselves across the sea. This was not accident. Ieyasu had learned from Sesai that the greatest victories often came to those who let others fight. He fulfilled his obligations to Hideyoshi punctiliously, providing supplies and support for the Korean campaigns, demonstrating loyalty that could not be faulted. But he kept his own army intact, his own treasury full, his own position strengthening while others weakened. The patience that had carried him through childhood captivity now expressed itself in a strategy so subtle that even Hideyoshi, who trusted no one and suspected everyone, seems not to have fully grasped what Ieyasu was doing. In 1590, between the Korean invasions, Hideyoshi completed his unification of Japan by destroying the last independent power in the east, the Hojo clan, whose domains centered on the great castle of Odawara. Ieyasu participated in the campaign, his forces contributing to the siege that eventually starved the Hojo into submission. The victory eliminated the final obstacle to Hideyoshi's supremacy and created an opportunity that would reshape Ieyasu's future. Hideyoshi ordered Ieyasu to leave his ancestral domains, the lands in Mikawa and the surrounding provinces that the Tokugawa had held for generations, the territories that Ieyasu had fought to reclaim and spent decades developing, the home where his family's graves lay and his retainers' roots ran deep. All of it was to be exchanged for the Hojo's former holdings in the Kanto region. The transfer was framed as a reward, an expansion of Ieyasu's holdings from 5 provinces to 8. In reality, it was exile, removal from his power base to distant territories where he would need to start over. Some of his retainers urged resistance. The insult was obvious, the intention transparent. Hideyoshi wanted Ieyasu far from the centers of power, occupied with the challenges of governing unfamiliar lands, his connections to his ancestral territories severed. To accept was to acknowledge that Hideyoshi could dispose of the Tokugawa as he pleased. To refuse was to invite the destruction that had befallen the Hojo. Ieyasu accepted. He gathered his household, his retainers, his records and treasures, and moved east to take possession of lands he had never ruled and a castle town he had never seen. The place was called Edo, a fishing village clustered around a modest fortress on the edge of a marshy bay. Compared to the developed territories he was leaving behind, it seemed like punishment disguised as promotion. He looked at the swamps and the shallow harbor and the rough wooden buildings of this frontier settlement, and he saw something that Hideyoshi had not intended him to see. He saw possibility. The Kanto plain was vast and fertile, its rice production potentially exceeding anything his former domains could have generated. Edo's harbor, properly developed, could become a center of commerce, linking the eastern provinces to markets throughout Japan. The very distance from Kyoto, that was meant to marginalize him could also shield him from the intrigues of Hideyoshi's court. He had been given a backwater. He would make it the foundation of everything that followed. The work began immediately. Engineers surveyed the swamps, planning the drainage channels and landfill projects that would transform marsh into usable land. Laborers diverted rivers, their new courses creating moats that would protect an expanding castle complex. Merchants were encouraged to settle, their shops and warehouses filling districts that had been empty months before. The small fishing village began its transformation into something larger, its growth directed by a lord who understood that real power rested not on military force alone, but on the wealth that administration and commerce could create. Ieyasu was 47 years old when he took possession of Edo. He had spent his entire life reacting to circumstances created by others, by the Oda and Imagawa, who had traded him as a child, by Nobunaga, who had demanded his son's death, by Hideyoshi, who had now sent him to the edge of Japan. For the first time, he held territory large enough and distant enough to build something entirely his own. The patience that had been his survival strategy was about to become his greatest weapon. While Hideyoshi aged and his health declined, while the Korean campaigns drained the strength of lords who might have rivaled Tokugawa power, Ieyasu built and waited and planned. The transformation of Edo consumed the decade that followed. What had been a fishing village of perhaps 100 houses became a city of tens of thousands. Its growth so rapid that visitors who had seen it one year returned the next to find neighborhoods where marshland had been. Ieyasu drove the work with the same methodical intensity he brought to everything, his engineers solving problems that would have daunted men with less patience. The Kanda River was diverted to create new channels. Hills were leveled to fill swamps. The castle at the city's heart expanded in concentric rings of walls and moats, each layer of fortification enclosing more territory than the last. The construction served purposes beyond defense. Every laborer who dug a canal or carried earth was a man not available to rival lords. Every merchant who established a shop in Edo's growing districts was a source of tax revenue and commercial intelligence. Every samurai who built a residence near the castle was binding himself more tightly to Tokugawa service. The city that rose from the marshes was not merely a seat of government, but an engine of power, its very existence strengthening Ieyasu's position in ways that military force alone could never have achieved. He governed the Kanto with careful attention to the details that other lords often neglected. Land surveys established exactly what each village could produce, enabling taxation that was firm but not ruinous. Irrigation projects increased yields on fields that had been marginal before the Tokugawa arrived. Disputes between villages were adjudicated promptly, their resolution demonstrating that order would be maintained and that appeals to Tokugawa justice would receive fair hearing. The farmers and merchants of the eastern provinces discovered that their new lord, whatever his reputation for cold calculation, governed with an efficiency that made their lives more predictable and often more prosperous. Meanwhile, far to the west, Hideyoshi's health was failing. The man who had risen from nothing to unite Japan was dying, and the question of what would follow his death hung over every political calculation in the country. He had a son, Hideyori, but the boy was barely 5 years old when Hideyoshi's condition became critical. A child could not hold what his father had built. Someone would need to govern in his name, and whoever that someone was would hold power that regency alone could not constrain. Hideyoshi understood the danger. In his final months, he constructed an elaborate system designed to preserve his son's inheritance. 5 great lords, the Gotairo, or Council of 5 Elders, would share responsibility for governing Japan, until Hideyori came of age. 5 commissioners would handle administrative matters. Oaths were sworn, documents signed, arrangements made that bound the most powerful men in the country to protect a child they had no reason to love and every reason to supplant. Ieyasu was the most powerful of the 5 elders, his position acknowledged by his placement at the head of the council. He swore the same oaths the others swore, pledged his loyalty to Hideyori with the same formulas they used, committed himself to the same restraints that were supposed to prevent any single lord from seizing what Hideyoshi was leaving behind. The ceremonies were performed with appropriate solemnity. The documents bore the seals of men whose word was supposed to bind them. Hideyoshi died in September 1598, perhaps believing that the structure he had created would hold. It began unraveling almost immediately. The oaths that had been sworn prohibited the great lords from arranging marriages among themselves without collective approval. Such alliances could shift the balance of power in ways that threatened everyone's security. Within months of Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu was negotiating exactly such marriages, linking Tokugawa interests with other powerful families through bonds that the other elders had not sanctioned. When challenged, he offered explanations that satisfied no one. The arrangements continued. His chief rival in the council was not one of the other great lords, but a man of lesser rank whose position rested on different foundations. Ishida Mitsunari had been one of Hideyoshi's most trusted administrators, his abilities in logistics and governance earning him influence that his relatively modest domain could not have provided. He was brilliant, arrogant, and utterly committed to preserving the Toyotomi inheritance against lords whose ambitions he correctly perceived. He was also deeply unpopular, with many of the warriors whose support any political movement would require. His manner was cold, his tongue was sharp, and his administrative efficiency had made enemies of men who preferred looser oversight of their affairs. The tension between Ieyasu and Mitsunari grew through 1599 and into 1600, their rivalry crystallizing the broader divisions within the Toyotomi coalition. Other lords aligned themselves according to calculations that mixed personal loyalty, family connection, regional interest, an assessment of who was likely to win the confrontation that everyone could see approaching. The country sorted itself into factions that would soon become armies, the peace that Hideyoshi had imposed cracking along lines that his death had exposed. Ieyasu played the game with a subtlety that Mitsunari could not match. Where his rival antagonized potential allies through bluntness and condescension, Ieyasu cultivated relationships with patience and apparent humility. He remembered the names of retainers' children. He sent gifts calibrated to recipients' tastes. He offered assistance to lords facing difficulties, creating obligations that might be called upon later. The network of connections he had spent decades building now encompassed much of the warrior class, its threads invisible until the moment when they would need to hold weight. The break came in the summer of 1600. Ieyasu had marched north to deal with a rebellious lord, a campaign that drew him away from the western regions where Mitsunari's support was strongest. While Ieyasu was occupied in the north, Mitsunari made his move. He assembled a coalition of lords loyal to the Toyotomi cause, declared Ieyasu a traitor to Hideyori's inheritance, and prepared to destroy the Tokugawa before they could respond. The news reached Ieyasu in early August. The coalition forming against him was formidable. On paper, Mitsunari's western army outnumbered the forces Ieyasu could immediately gather. Lords whose loyalty Ieyasu had thought secure were wavering, their messengers carrying carefully ambiguous responses that committed them to nothing while they waited to see which side would prevail. The months of political preparation were about to be tested against the brutal clarity of war. Ieyasu turned his army south. The march that followed covered ground, with a speed that demonstrated just how seriously he took the threat. Messages flew ahead of his columns, reaching lords whose allegiance remained uncertain, urging them to declare themselves before the opportunity to choose the winning side had passed. Some committed to him immediately, others continued to hedge. The campaign would be decided not merely by the battles fought, but by the decisions made in castle chambers across Japan, where lords weighed their options and calculated their chances. By October, the two armies had converged on a place called Sekigahara, a valley in the mountains, where roads from east and west came together among rice fields and small villages. The geography favored neither side clearly. Everything would depend on the men who fought there, and on the choices that commanders made when the fog of that autumn morning finally lifted. Ieyasu had done everything that preparation could do. He had built his domain, cultivated his alliances, positioned his forces, and calculated the loyalties of men whose decisions would determine the outcome. 57 years of education, in captivity, in war, in politics, in loss, had led to this valley and the battle that would be fought when dawn came. The child who had been traded between enemies, the young lord who had sacrificed his son to preserve an alliance, the patient rival who had watched and waited while others exhausted themselves. All of it had been preparation for the hours ahead. The fate of Japan would be decided before the sun set on the following day. Fog filled the valley when the armies woke on the morning of October 21st, 1600. It clung to the rice fields and obscured the mountain slopes, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards and making it impossible to assess the enemy's full disposition. Somewhere in that grey murk, tens of thousands of warriors were preparing for a battle whose outcome neither side could predict with confidence. Ieyasu's eastern army held positions in the valley's center. Mitsunari's western army occupied the heights to the west and north, their formations curving around the Tokugawa forces in an arc that looked, on paper, like the beginning of an encirclement. The fighting began in the mid-morning, after the fog had thinned enough for commanders to see their targets. The initial engagements favored neither side decisively. Units clashed along the valley floor, their struggles producing local victories and local defeats that did not yet determine the battle's overall direction. Ieyasu watched from his command post, receiving reports, issuing orders, waiting for the moment when the contest's true shape would reveal itself. That shape depended on men who had not yet committed themselves. On the heights overlooking the battlefield, several contingents of the Western Army remained motionless, their banners visible but their warriors idle. These were lords who had joined Mitsunari's coalition for reasons of their own, whose loyalty to his cause was uncertain, whose messengers had been in secret contact with Ieyasu for weeks. The battle unfolding below them was not merely a military contest, but a political one, its outcome depending on whether these wavering allies would honor their commitments or betray them. The most important of these uncertain allies was Kobayakawa Hideaki, a young lord whose forces occupied a crucial position on the Western Army's flank. He had committed to Mitsunari, but had also been negotiating with Ieyasu, his intentions opaque even to those closest to him. As the morning wore on and the battle's outcome remained undecided, his inaction became increasingly conspicuous. Mitsunari sent messengers demanding that he attack. The messengers returned without satisfactory answers. Ieyasu decided to force the issue. He ordered his gunners to fire on Kobayakawa's position. Not a full assault, but a provocation, designed to compel a choice that continued hesitation was delaying. The shot struck the hillside where Kobayakawa's men waited. The message was unmistakable. Decide now, or become a target for both sides. Kobayakawa decided. His forces surged down the hillside and struck the Western Army's flank. Not the Eastern Army, as his alliance with Mitsunari required, but his supposed allies. The betrayal shattered formations that had been holding their ground. The sudden attack from an unexpected direction, creating panic that spread through units that had been fighting competently moments before. Other wavering lords, seeing which way the battle was turning, made their own calculations and switched sides. The Western Army's coherence collapsed in less than an hour. By early afternoon, it was over. Mitsunari's coalition had disintegrated, its surviving units fleeing westward or surrendering where they stood. The battle that was supposed to determine Japan's future had lasted perhaps 6 hours. Its outcome decided not by superior tactics or greater courage, but by political arrangements that Ieyasu had been cultivating for years. The relationships he had built, the obligations he had created, the loyalties he had secured through patience and attention, all of it had paid off in a single morning's betrayals. The aftermath required a different kind of calculation. Ieyasu had won the battle, but the victory would mean nothing if he could not convert military success into political settlement. Lords who had fought against him needed to be dealt with, some through execution, some through dispossession, some through pardons that would bind them to gratitude. Lords who had fought for him expected rewards commensurate with their contributions. The entire map of Japan was about to be redrawn, and every decision Ieyasu made would create friends or enemies for generations to come. Ishida Mitsunari was captured a few days after the battle, found hiding in a mountain cave, his grand coalition reduced to a fugitive's desperate flight. Ieyasu had him executed, but without the elaborate humiliations that some victors might have imposed. The man who had been his most determined opponent died with a dignity that his circumstances could not entirely erase. Other leaders of the Western Army met similar fates, their deaths necessary to demonstrate that rebellion against Tokugawa power carried consequences, but conducted without the vindictive cruelty that might have provoked future resistance. The land redistribution that followed reshaped Japan's political geography in ways that would persist for 2.5 centuries. Lords who had supported Ieyasu, the Fudai daimyo, whose families had served the Tokugawa for generations, received domains in strategic locations, their territories forming a network of loyal strongholds throughout the country. Lords who had opposed him or whose loyalty remained uncertain, the Tozama daimyo, the outside lords, were pushed to the periphery, their domains distant from centers of power and watched by neighbors whose reliability Ieyasu could trust. The arrangement was not merely punitive, but structural, a system designed to make future challenges to Tokugawa supremacy as difficult as possible. The years immediately following Sekigahara saw Ieyasu consolidating a position that victory had made possible, but not yet permanent. He was the most powerful lord in Japan, his armies the strongest, his wealth the greatest, his network of alliances the most extensive. But power without legitimacy remained vulnerable to challenges that legal authority could prevent. What Ieyasu needed was a title that would place his supremacy beyond question, a title that only the emperor could grant, drawing on traditions that reached back centuries, to a time when warriors had first displaced the imperial court as Japan's true rulers. In 1603, Ieyasu traveled to Kyoto to receive from the emperor the appointment he had been preparing for since he changed his name to Tokugawa decades earlier. The title was Sei-i Taishogun, great general who subdues the barbarians. The military office that had been held by the Minamoto shoguns who established warrior rule in the 12th century, and by the Ashikaga shoguns who had governed, increasingly ineffectively, until the wars of the Sengoku period had reduced their authority to nothing. By claiming Minamoto descent through his Tokugawa lineage, Ieyasu had made himself eligible for an office that other warlords, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, had never held. The ceremony was conducted with the solemnity that the occasion demanded. In the imperial palace, surrounded by courtiers whose families had served the throne since before the first shoguns had risen, Ieyasu received the commission that transformed him from a victorious general into Japan's legitimate military ruler. The empire that Nobunaga had begun to build, that Hideyoshi had nearly completed, that Sekigahara had decided, that empire now had a legal foundation, that rebellion could challenge but not easily overturn. He was 60 years old. The journey from hostage child to shogun had taken more than half a century, its course winding through captivity and warfare, alliance and betrayal, loss that would have broken men with less capacity for endurance. Now he stood at the summit of Japanese power, his position secured by military victory and imperial sanction, his family's dominance of the country apparently assured for generations to come. But Ieyasu had watched too many successions fail to trust that his own arrangements would hold without careful management. Hideyoshi had built elaborate structures to protect his son's inheritance, and those structures had collapsed within 2 years of his death. The Ashikaga shoguns had presided over a fragmentation of power that reduced their office to ceremonial irrelevance. If the Tokugawa were to avoid similar fates, they would need to establish patterns of succession and governance that could survive the death of their founder. In 1605, Ieyasu took a step that surprised observers who did not understand his thinking. He resigned the office of shogun in favor of his son, Hidetada, a transfer of power conducted while Ieyasu was still healthy, still vigorous, still fully capable of ruling. The resignation made Hidetada the second Tokugawa shogun, his position legitimized by his father's voluntary abdication, rather than by the uncertain processes that followed a ruler's death. The move was strategic, not sacrificial. Ieyasu retained enormous power as the retired shogun, the Ogosho, his influence over policy and personnel undiminished by his formal withdrawal from office. What the resignation accomplished was a demonstration that Tokugawa succession could proceed smoothly, that the transition from one shogun to the next did not require the death of the predecessor, that the family's grip on power was institutionalized rather than dependent on any single individual. Hidetada would learn to govern while his father still lived to correct his mistakes. The dynasty would be strengthened by a continuity that other ruling families had failed to achieve. Ieyasu withdrew to Sunpu, the castle town where he had spent his years as an Imagawa hostage, the place where Sesai Choro had shaped his mind and his character. The boy who had learned patience in captivity returned as the most powerful man in Japan, his position secured, his succession arranged, his life's work approaching completion. But one threat remained. A boy in a castle in Osaka, the son of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, whose very existence represented a challenge to Tokugawa legitimacy that time alone would not resolve. The years at Sunpu passed in rhythms that Ieyasu had never before been able to enjoy. He rose early, as he always had, but the hours that followed were no longer consumed by the urgent demands of military campaign or political crisis. He read Chinese classics, Buddhist sutras, works of history and philosophy that he had collected throughout his life, but rarely found time to study. He practiced falconry in the fields around the castle, the hunt providing exercise and diversion without the dangers of actual warfare. He received visitors, granted audiences, offered advice to the son who now held the title of shogun, but who understood that real authority still resided in his father's hands. His household included scholars and craftsmen, monks and physicians, men whose company he found more congenial than the warriors who had dominated his earlier years. He corresponded with foreigners whose presence in Japan had increased during the decades of civil war. Dutch merchants, English sailors, Portuguese missionaries, Spanish traders. Their knowledge of the world beyond Japan fascinated a man who had spent his life mastering a single island nation. He questioned them about their countries, their religions, their ships, and their weapons, storing information that might prove useful even if he never traveled to the lands they described. One foreigner, in particular, had earned a place in Ieyasu's inner circle. William Adams was an English navigator who had arrived in Japan in 1600, shipwrecked after a disastrous attempt to reach Asia via the southern route around the Americas. Where other Europeans were viewed with suspicion, their missionary activities and colonial ambitions increasingly troubling to Japanese authorities, Adams possessed technical skills that Ieyasu valued. He knew how to build ocean-going ships in the European style. He understood navigation and gunnery. He was willing to share this knowledge without the religious conditions that the Catholic powers attached to their cooperation. Ieyasu granted Adams an estate and a stipend, effectively making him a samurai in Tokugawa service. The Englishman became an advisor on foreign affairs, his insights shaping policies that would have profound consequences for Japan's relationship with the outside world. He warned Ieyasu about the imperial ambitions of Spain and Portugal, about the connection between missionary work and colonial conquest, about the dangers of allowing foreign powers to establish the kind of footholds that had led to European domination of territories in the Americas and Southeast Asia. The warnings reinforced suspicions that Ieyasu had already begun to form. The Christian question had been simmering throughout his rise to power. Missionaries had been active in Japan for decades, their converts numbering in the hundreds of thousands by some estimates. Hideyoshi had viewed them with hostility, issuing edicts of expulsion that were inconsistently enforced and largely ineffective. Ieyasu had initially been more tolerant, his interest in foreign trade outweighing his concerns about foreign religion. But as reports accumulated of Christian communities that answered to priests rather than lords, of converts who declared loyalty to a foreign pope above loyalty to Japanese authority, his calculations shifted. The edicts restricting Christianity came gradually, their severity increasing as Ieyasu's concerns deepened. Missionaries were ordered to leave. Japanese converts were pressured to renounce their faith. The foreign trade that had provided incentive for tolerance was redirected toward the Protestant Dutch and English, whose commercial interests did not come packaged with religious demands. The foundations were being laid for the isolation that would eventually seal Japan off from most contact with the outside world. A policy that Ieyasu initiated and that his successors would carry to its logical extreme. But the most pressing threat to Tokugawa permanence was not foreign. It was Japanese, and it resided in Osaka Castle, where Toyotomi Hideyori had grown from the child Ieyasu had sworn to protect into a young man around whom opposition to the new order might crystallize. The castle itself was formidable, perhaps the greatest fortress in Japan, its walls and moats designed by Hideyoshi to withstand any siege. The Toyotomi name still carried weight among lords who remembered the father's achievements and resented the Tokugawa usurpation. As long as Hideyori lived, as long as Osaka Castle stood, the settlement that Sekigahara had imposed remained vulnerable to challenge. Ieyasu had tried other approaches first. He had arranged for his granddaughter to marry Hideyori, hoping that family connection might neutralize political danger. He had treated the young man with public respect, maintaining the fiction that the Tokugawa served the Toyotomi legacy, even as they systematically dismantled everything Hideyoshi had built. He had waited, as he always waited, for time and circumstance to resolve problems that direct action might complicate. But Hideyori would not submit, would not retire into obscurity, would not accept the diminished status that survival required. The pretext for war came in 1614, manufactured from an inscription on a temple bell that Hideyori had commissioned. The inscription contained phrases that could be interpreted, with sufficient determination to find offense, as curses against the Tokugawa. Ieyasu declared himself insulted. Negotiations failed to produce satisfaction. In the winter of 1614, Tokugawa forces surrounded Osaka Castle. The siege that followed was the largest military operation Japan had seen since Sekigahara. Tens of thousands of warriors converged on the castle, their encampments spreading across the plain that surrounded its walls. But the fortress proved as formidable as its reputation suggested. The outer defenses held against initial assaults. The garrison, swelled by ronin, masterless samurai, who had gathered to the Toyotomi banner, fought with a desperation that inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. Winter weather made sustained operations difficult. Ieyasu agreed to a truce. The terms of that truce accomplished what assault had not. In exchange for peace, Hideyori agreed to allow the filling of Osaka Castle's outer moats, a concession presented as a gesture of goodwill, but understood by everyone as a fatal weakening of his defenses. Tokugawa forces set to work immediately, their laborers dumping earth into the water barriers that had made the castle nearly impregnable. By the time the work was complete, Osaka's defenses had been reduced from multiple rings of moats and walls to a single inner fortification that could not withstand a determined attack. The final campaign came in the summer of 1615. This time, there would be no negotiation, no truce, no outcome short of the Toyotomi's complete destruction. Ieyasu's forces stormed the weakened castle, their assault overwhelming defenders who no longer had the depth of fortification that had saved them months earlier. The fighting was fierce and the casualties heavy, but the outcome was never in doubt. Osaka Castle fell. Hideyori and his mother, Yodogimi, Hideyoshi's favorite consort, who had remained with her son through everything, died in the flames of the castle's final destruction. Some accounts say they committed suicide, others that they were killed by Tokugawa soldiers. The distinction mattered less than the result. The Toyotomi line was extinguished, and no rival to Tokugawa supremacy remained. Ieyasu had resolved the last great question of his career through the methods he had employed throughout his life. Patience, preparation, the willingness to use violence when other approaches failed, and the ruthlessness to see bloody work through to its completion. He was 72 years old. The energy that had carried him through decades of warfare and political struggle was finally beginning to fade. In the months following Osaka's fall, he turned his attention to the legal foundations that would govern Japan after his death. The Buke Shohato, the laws for the military houses, codified the restrictions that would keep the daimyo subordinate to Tokugawa authority. Lords were forbidden from making alliances without permission, from building new fortifications, from marrying without shogunal approval. The system that Ieyasu had constructed through decades of political maneuvering was now inscribed in law, its provisions enforceable by a central government whose right to enforce them the laws themselves established. He fell ill in the early months of 1616. The precise nature of his sickness remains uncertain. Some historians suggest stomach cancer, others point to different possibilities. But its severity was clear from the beginning. The man who had survived captivity and battle, assassination attempts, and political betrayal, found himself facing an enemy that no amount of patience or preparation could defeat. He continued working as long as his strength permitted, receiving reports, issuing instructions, ensuring that the transition to Hidetada's unchallenged rule would proceed smoothly. On June 1st, 1616, Tokugawa Ieyasu died at Sunpu Castle. He was 73 years old. He had outlived Nobunaga by 34 years and Hideyoshi by 18. He had been a hostage, an ally, a rival, a shogun, and a retired power behind the throne. He had built a system of governance that would endure for 250 years, longer than any previous Japanese regime, longer than most dynasties in human history. His body was buried at Kunozan, a mountain overlooking Sunpu, according to instructions he had left before his death. But his spirit, the priests declared, would be enshrined at Nikko, in the mountains north of Edo, where a great complex of temples and shrines would be constructed to honor the man who had united Japan. He was deified as Tosho Daigongen, the great Gongen, light of the east, a divine protector whose blessing would watch over the Tokugawa realm for as long as it endured. The child who had been set adrift on currents of war and politics, who had learned that survival required patience and that patience required strength, had become a god. The education that began in captivity had reached its final lesson, that those who endure long enough can shape the world that comes after them, their influence extending beyond death into futures they will never see. The shrine at Nikko rose through the years following Ieyasu's death, its construction consuming resources and labor on a scale that matched the man it was meant to honor. Craftsmen carved and gilded, painters applied colors that blazed against the dark cedar forests surrounding the sacred precinct. The Yomemun Gate alone required the work of master artisans whose skills had been refined through generations of temple building, its surfaces covered with more than 500 sculptures depicting dragons and sages, flowers and phoenixes, the imagery overwhelming in its intricacy and abundance. The complex that emerged was unlike anything Japan had built before. Not the austere elegance that Zen aesthetics favored, but something deliberately excessive, a declaration in wood and gold and lacquer that the Tokugawa had achieved what no previous family had achieved and intended their achievement to be remembered. Pilgrims began arriving even before the construction was complete. They climbed the mountain roads through forests where cedar trees grew to heights that seemed to touch the clouds, their progress marked by stone lanterns donated by daimyo, eager to demonstrate their devotion to the deified founder. At the shrine itself, they offered prayers to Tosho Daigongen, asking the Great Spirit's blessing on their families and their endeavors. The man who had been Ieyasu, the hostage child, the patient lord, the shogun who waited, had become something beyond human memory, his identity absorbed into a divine presence that the faithful approached with reverence rather than historical curiosity. Below, in the cities and villages of Japan, the peace he had built settled into patterns that would persist for generations. The Sankin Kotai system that Ieyasu had conceived and his successors formalized required every daimyo to spend alternate years in Edo, their families remaining in the capital permanently as hostages whose presence guaranteed their lord's good behavior. The arrangement served multiple purposes. It kept potential rivals under surveillance. It drained their treasuries through the expense of maintaining two households, and it created a national elite whose members knew each other through years of shared residence in the shogun's city. The lords who might have challenged Tokugawa's supremacy found themselves entangled in a web of obligation and expense that left little energy for rebellion. Edo grew into one of the largest cities on earth. The fishing village that Ieyasu had received as punishment became a metropolis of more than 1 million people. Merchants and craftsmen, samurai and servants, entertainers and scholars, all drawn to a capital whose growth seemed to have no limit. The castle at the city's heart expanded through successive constructions until its walls enclosed more territory than any fortress in Japan, its white towers visible from miles away across the flat Kanto plain. The swamps that Ieyasu's engineers had drained became districts where commerce flourished and culture developed forms that had never existed before. The peace that settled over Japan was not merely an absence of war, but a presence of order that touched every aspect of life. Farmers knew what taxes they owed and could plan their labor accordingly. Merchants operated within regulations that were predictable even when they were restrictive. The roads that connected Edo to the provinces were maintained and policed, their travelers moving with a security that the Sengoku period had never known. For the first time in centuries, a child born in Japan could reasonably expect to live out a natural lifespan without experiencing the destruction of war. This stability came at costs that Ieyasu had accepted and that his successors enforced with increasing rigor. The class system hardened into categories that permitted little movement. Samurai remained samurai. Farmers remained farmers. Merchants remained merchants, their positions fixed by birth rather than ability. The isolation from the outside world that Ieyasu had begun became nearly complete under his grandson Ieyasu, the third shogun, whose edicts prohibited Japanese from traveling abroad and restricted foreign contact to a single Dutch trading post on an artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. The Christianity that Ieyasu had viewed with suspicion was exterminated through persecutions that killed thousands of believers and drove survivors into hidden communities where faith was practiced in secret for generations. Yet within these constraints, a civilization flourished that produced achievements the war-torn Sengoku period could never have permitted. The kabuki theater developed its elaborate conventions, its actors becoming celebrities whose images adorned woodblock prints sold throughout the country. The haiku reached its mature form in the wandering poetry of Matsuo Basho, whose verses captured moments of beauty and transience in 17 syllables. The pleasure quarters of Edo and Osaka and Kyoto cultivated arts of entertainment, whose sophistication rivaled anything the aristocratic courts had produced. The peace that Ieyasu had built became the foundation for a cultural flowering that would define Japan's identity for centuries. The shoguns who followed him varied in ability and temperament, but the system he had designed proved resilient enough to survive their variations. Weak shoguns could be managed by capable advisors. Strong shoguns could build on foundations that required maintenance rather than construction. The bureaucratic structures that administered Tokugawa Japan became increasingly sophisticated, their officials developing expertise that made governance more efficient even as it became more impersonal. The personal rule that Ieyasu had exercised gave way to institutional authority that functioned regardless of the individual who held the shogun's title. For 250 years, the arrangement held. 15 shoguns succeeded Ieyasu, their reigns spanning the period from his death in 1616 to the restoration of imperial rule in 1868. Wars occurred at the margins, the suppression of the Christian rebellion at Shimabara in 1638, occasional conflicts with Ainu peoples in the north, but nothing approaching the devastation that had preceded Tokugawa rule. Generations of Japanese lived and died without ever seeing a battle. Their understanding of warfare derived from stories and plays rather than experience. The peace became so normal that the samurai class, maintained as a military aristocracy, gradually forgot the martial skills that had justified their existence. The ending, when it came, arrived from directions that Ieyasu could not have anticipated. Black ships from America appeared in Edo Bay in 1853, their steam engines and heavy guns demonstrating technologies that Japan's isolation had prevented it from developing. The demands for trade and diplomatic relations that Commodore Perry carried could not be refused without risking a destruction that the decayed Tokugawa military could not prevent. The shogunate that had maintained order for so long proved incapable of meeting a challenge that required adaptation rather than preservation. The years that followed saw Japan transform itself more rapidly than any society in history, its leaders recognizing that survival required embracing the very changes that isolation had been designed to prevent. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, resigned his office in 1867, returning political authority to an emperor whose ancestors had been figureheads for 7 centuries. The Meiji Restoration swept away the structures that Ieyasu had built, the daimyo domains, the class restrictions, the isolation from foreign contact, replacing them with institutions modeled on the Western powers that had forced Japan's opening. But the end of the Tokugawa system was not a repudiation of everything Ieyasu had achieved. The unity he had created persisted through the transformation, the nation he had forged remaining a nation, even as its government changed beyond recognition. The bureaucratic traditions his administration had developed provided foundations for the modern state that emerged from the Meiji reforms. The centuries of peace had allowed population growth and economic development that gave Japan resources to modernize at a pace that astonished Western observers. The country that emerged onto the world stage in the late 19th century owed its existence as a unified nation to the work that had begun at Sekigahara and continued through 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule. Today, the shrine at Nikko still stands among its ancient cedars, its buildings preserved through centuries of careful maintenance, its precincts visited by tourists whose numbers would have astonished the pilgrims of earlier ages. The Yomeimon Gate still blazes with color against the mountain forests. The tomb where Ieyasu's remains rest still receives offerings from those who honor the founder's memory. The man has been dead for more than 400 years, but something of what he built persists in the orderliness that visitors notice in Japanese society, in the patience that characterizes Japanese approaches to difficulty, in the long-term thinking that shapes Japanese institutions. The saying that Japanese schoolchildren once learned captured something essential about the 3 men who united their country. Nobunaga pounded the rice cake, Hideyoshi kneaded it, and Ieyasu ate it. The metaphor acknowledged that Ieyasu had benefited from his predecessor's work, that the unification he completed had been begun by Nobunaga's conquests and advanced by Hideyoshi's administration. But the metaphor also missed something crucial. Nobunaga had died by betrayal, his achievements scattered among rivals who fought over his legacy. Hideyoshi had died with his life's work unprotected, his son's inheritance destroyed within 2 years of his passing. Only Ieyasu had built something that endured beyond his death, his patience finding its ultimate expression in a peace that outlasted not just his lifetime, but his dynasty's lifetime, shaping a nation that still bears marks of his influence. The mist still rises over the mountains of Japan in the early morning hours, as it rose over Mikawa on the day of his birth. The rice paddies still reflect the sky in the valleys, where farmers have worked since before history was recorded. The castles that survived the wars and the modernization still stand on their hills, their walls remembering a time when power grew from the willingness to wait and the strength to act when waiting ended. And in the shrine, among the cedars, the spirit of the man who waited longest of all still receives the prayers of those who understand what patience can accomplish. Tokugawa Ieyasu was born a hostage and died a god. Between those endpoints stretched a life that demonstrated, more clearly than any other in Japanese history, that the race does not always go to the swift. The child who watched and learned while others acted, the young lord who endured while others exhausted themselves, the patient rival who built while others fought. He had understood something that his more brilliant contemporaries had not. Victory belongs not to those who strike first, but to those who strike last. And he who strikes last writes the history that those who come after will remember. His name was Ieyasu, and he taught Japan what peace could mean.